Good afternoon. And welcome. Welcome back. It's 2025, March. We're first lunch of the year. I start by acknowledging that we're gathered today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the lands of wherever our virtual audience may be joining us from today. My respects to any First Nations people in the room or online, and acknowledging that this land is and always will be Aboriginal land. I know all of you, and you all know me, but my name is Emma Dawson. I'm Executive Director at Capita, and this is our first John Cain lunch for 2025. Really pleased to be back with all of you. We've got a big couple of days ahead, which you'll hear about from me shortly. We're here to talk about tax. Yes, in an election year. It's brave and it's crazy, but it's got to be done. And we are here ahead of our two-day Community Tax Summit, which kicks off at 9 a.m. tomorrow at Trades Hall. If you haven't already got a ticket, I think it's too late, but we will be recording the entire thing, and it will be, I hope, a couple of days of really stimulating conversation about what we need to do to create a secure, sustainable, safe and healthy future for our children and our grandchildren. And on that note, I'm going to invite now to talk to you Thomas Walker. Thomas is the head of Think Forward, which is a generational justice or think tank, particularly focused on economic justice for younger people. And Tom is represents one of the partner organisations in our tax summit and will be there with us for the full 2 days. They've got a very effective and interesting campaign at the moment called Tax Wealth Not Work, and Tom is going to talk to you about that before I come back up here and tell you all about the tax summit. Thanks. Tom.
Very good. Oh, hi everyone. Thank you for the invite. Love talking about policy over lunch. It's so nice. It's much better than a Zoom call from my bedroom like it usually is. So I'm Tom. I'm an economist and the CEO of Think Forward. We're a small advocacy, education, and research organisation which we founded about 4 or 5 years ago now because we want to show how Australia's economic and tax settings were making it harder for younger generations to build their own lives. This was sort of back in the era of Turnbull and Morrison, when I guess the narrative was that younger people just needed to work harder, they needed to buy less avocado toast, and they would be okay. But we really wanted to show that there was big structural issues at play in our economic systems that were making it harder for people to set up their lives. So yeah, we do this by doing our own research and advocacy, and we also pride ourselves on trying to educate younger generations about how the tax and transfer system works as well. What does this look like practically? Yeah, we've released 3 of our own independent research reports now with more to come. I was appointed to the Albanese government's aged care task force to talk about intergenerational fairness in how we fund aged care. We've been on Q&A and insiders and pop up all over the place over recent years. It's been really exciting. But yeah, today Emma has very kindly invited me here to talk about our new campaign, Tax Wealth Not Work. And the campaign addresses 3 core issues we've identified over the past several years, working with younger people in their understanding of the tax system. So the first problem is that we can see that our tax system rewards the wrong things. And we like to say that, we don't like to say, but we do say that our futures are being denied. As younger people, we notice it in our daily lives. Like we've all got big HECS debts, with housing crisis, declining real wages, growing tax collections, and growing intergenerational wealth inequality. And then these issues are compounded by climate change, which we also, and all these issues we say are also contributing to things like we have a mental health crisis in young people, with really low rates of entrepreneurship, and of course, declining birth rates and people are really finding it hard to start a family. And we argue that the tax system plays a big role in all of this. We say that there's an implicit intergenerational bargain that sits underneath our tax and transfer system that's under pressure, where it's absolutely natural that older generations control much of the nation's wealth. They're our landowners and shareholders, they run our companies and dominate politics. That's completely normal, but as custodians there is a responsibility to make sure that opportunity, access to capital is shared with people that are coming up from behind, so younger generations. And it's vital that younger people can, if they work hard, they can get on the bottom rung of the wealth creation ladder. So it's not a very big ask, we don't think. It's just that younger generations are presented with the same opportunities as generations prior. This is also not about any sort of intergenerational warfare. We're not interested in that at all. We argue that older, wealthy Australians have simply done what they've been told to do by our governments over recent decades. Our tax system rewards investing in property and building wealth. And if I was looking at our aged care system and our pension system, I would try and have as much private wealth as I could possibly get as well. But we do argue that this system that we have is rewarding wealth accumulation way too favourably over someone's work and effort. So we have a situation where younger workers without assets are often paying more tax than multimillionaires or property investors because of the way that we have all of these tax concessions which flow to wealth holders. And instead of giving younger people a great start to life, we load them up with student debt and housing debt, which means they spend their entire working life just trying to get out from underneath this burden we've placed on them. So that feels like a really crazy situation to us. It's like, why aren't we investing in our young people? And at school, I think that the millennial story at least is that if you sort of work hard, go to university, get a good job, you'll be able to set yourself up for life. And for lots of younger people, that now feels like a lie. But don't take my word for it. So Ken Henry, author of the last major tax review in 2010, has said that the tax system is an intergenerational tragedy. Productivity Commission Chief Danielle Woodway, the head of Grattan, said that the degree of age segregation in the current tax system is neither defensible nor sustainable. In September, former union leader Bill Kelty said the tax system is particularly brutish for younger people, and that the tax system makes industries out of tax breaks. And Business Council CEO Brian Black has recently argued that Labor and Coalition are consigning younger generations to a future of higher taxes, ballooning government debt, and poorer living standards. I actually doubt there's many issues where you kind of get that cross-political spectrum support that something is broken and needs fixing, as we do around how the tax system is holding back younger generations. So there's a real strong case for reform. But the second problem that we've identified and we work on is that younger Australians feel ignored by the political system. They feel that their voices and values aren't included in the crucial economic and tax debates that shape the future. And so to bring younger voices into those debates, we did a big survey last year of 1,000 Gen Z and millennial Australians. A large majority, 87%, said they don't feel supported by the government, and 90% said that the tax system isn't fair across generations. Almost all of our survey respondents talked about how hard it is to live a good, economically secure life. A 32-year-old full-time worker told us that it's become much more difficult to live now on what would have been a decent wage 20 years ago. I'm back living with my parents now. While a 33-year-old from New South Wales said, both my partner and I are in well-earning jobs, but we still have financial stress. We feel hopeless about our financial security. While a 36-year-old reported that they had $80,000 worth of student loan debt, saying they will never be able to have children because I can barely afford to look after myself. The window for me is rapidly closing for me to buy a house, clear my debt, and have children. Now notice we're not talking about 22-year-olds who spend too much money on breakfast. These are middle-class people in their 30s who are university educated and have done everything we've told them to do. Yet they still have this financial anxiety hanging over them and this feeling that things aren't getting better. It's also worth noting that these issues predate the cost of living crisis. The cost of living crisis has just brought these issues to the fore. The other concerning statistic from the survey we did, I think, is that only 3% of 1,000 younger people we survey felt that their political leaders are doing a good job of thinking and planning for the future. A student from Melbourne told us that Australia's politicians are deeply afflicted by short-termism. They care about the next election. They don't care about the long-term future of the community. In fairness to our political leaders, I have seen our Prime Minister in recent weeks going around saying that intergenerational equity is one of the biggest issues at this election, which is really encouraging, saying that younger people feel like they're not getting a fair crack. And we know that the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, student loan debts are all on the political agenda as well. But I think the problem remains that neither Labor or the Coalition actually have a serious plan to address the tax settings that actually drive a lot of these issues that sit underneath. So we're kind of stuck with band-aid solutions still. I actually think this is really worrying, particularly in light of some of the political results we're seeing overseas with sort of the rise of far-right movements. The New York Times, they did an article last week where they went and talked to far-right voters across Europe and about why they voted for the far-right. And they talked about immigration, which is gross, obviously, but all the other issues were all about economic security, housing, access to good employment, and a frustration that their political leaders weren't acting for the community and on their behalf. So that's alarming to me because it's very similar to the story that we get through our survey work with younger people. And so it leads me to think, like, where is this big progressive vision for Australia that younger generations can get behind in this sort of project of building our nation? And I don't think there is one at the moment, which is why I'm really excited about our Community Tax Summit tomorrow, because it's an opportunity for us to come together to start doing some of that vision and agenda setting, because there's a lot of organisations out there who are thinking bigger picture, who are thinking about tax reform and the future of our country. The third key issue we're working on is that tax literacy is low in younger generations. According to the Reserve Bank, enrolments in economics has declined 70% in the last 30 years. And so at a societal level, the inaccessibility of economics and the drop in economic literacy means that a smaller and more select group of people are making decisions about how our society is designed ultimately. And we think this is helping vested interests control the narrative about tax reform. In addition, we're also seeing that the economic resources that are pitched at younger people are about individual financial success. So they're about budgeting, but they're also about investing in shares or tax minimisation or cryptocurrencies. And so this means that our tax debates are increasingly framed in this idea of individual financial success, not an idea of collective well-being through the tax and transfer system. And I think this, again, is really worrying that we're losing that language of collective well-being. So what we're doing about it at Think Forward across these three problems, the broken tax system, the lack of long-term thinking and vision, and declining economic literacy, is that we want to work and are working with younger generations who we count as all up to people in their early 40s now. Like that same story of finding it really hard to set their lives up because they would just happen to be born at the wrong time. So we're trying to build public support for tax reform because we want to support our political leaders to act, and we really want to tell a different story about tax and why it's important to our lives as younger generations. We are frustrated that our political leaders have seemingly stopped leading and educating the community and seemingly are opinion takers as opposed to opinion shapers. But we think that's public opinion shaping is really important. So I guess we're trying to make a small contribution to that cause. So this year we're running 2 public-facing efforts to socialise the need for tax reform. The first is our Tax Wealth Not Work campaign, which I've got here, and I'll put some copies around later, which is all about calling on the next Parliament to reform the tax system so it rewards work and effort, not wealth accumulation and rent seeking and all these kinds of things that are denying opportunity to people who don't own assets and wealth. So that'll include the delivery of an open letter to the new Parliament, and it's going to be signed by younger generations. And experts like Amber and Saul Westlake and Professor Miranda Stewart have got on board, which is really great. But also in intergenerational solidarity. Like it's actually a 50-50 split at the moment between older generations and younger generations who have signed the open letter. We get a lot of support from older Australians who absolutely recognise the challenges that younger people are facing. So we have 5 main asks. The first one is that we want the government to reduce or remove tax concessions so passive incomes and gains from wealth are taxed at similar rates from work. Again, we want to see work and effort required, whether that's work or entrepreneurship or studying or even caring for your loved ones. Like that should be rewarded over if you've got $500,000 to dump into property. We want to see Australia's wealth better shared across generations, so younger people have access to opportunity and being able to invest in themselves no matter who their parents are. So this is about looking at things like inheritance and gifts and large super balances and how we tax land or resources, to think about how we rebalance the scale between taxes on work and effort and wealth. And then with the money raised, we want to prevent the share of tax collected from younger workers from growing unfairly, as it's currently forecast in the intergenerational report due to an ageing population. We want to better support people trying to set up their lives, again, which includes students, entrepreneurs, younger workers, as well as the under and unemployed as well. And then the fifth ask is that we want to repair government budgets so we can actually invest in the services that Australians rely on, so education, health, housing, aged care. And we also want to have some financial buffers to deal with future economic shocks as well, because at the moment the costs of climate change are just being completely left to younger generations, and that's a humongous financial burden. And then the second part of the equation of our work is education. So this is about increasing tax literacy in the community. So we have we have an education program called TikTok Tax, which is currently a 2-hour workshop, but we've got funding from Lord Mayors to expand and think about that more in 2025, which is really exciting. So it could be an online web app, it could be a game, it could be working with social media influencers, it could be good old-fashioned billboards. We're not sure yet, but that's quite exciting that we're still in that discovery phase. So if any of that sounds interesting, please do get in touch. Like, how do we educate younger people about the tax system, and like, what could that look like? Love people's ideas and opinions. Or on the campaign, we're looking for organisations and individuals to sign on to the open letter, which you can find on our Instagram and website, and I'll share a few copies around, which has a QR code on it as well. So that's a big help, showing that we've got this sort of broad support for the kind of reforms we're asking for. To close, I'll just say that younger generations aren't looking for tax cuts or handouts, just an even playing field. They just want the same opportunities as generations prior. And I 100% believe that tax reform can unlock Australia's potential and address many of the big issues we face, from housing to mental health challenges to climate. Like, the tax system sits at the heart of a lot of those things. I also believe that younger generations are burning with passion and ideas. And I think if we invest in them and actually allow for them to have security and confidence in their economic situation, to take risks, to start a family, to start a business, to get educated, then I think we can continue to build a better society and economy for all of us, and we can restore the supposed Australian ideal of the fair go. And that's me. Thank you.
So that gives you a pretty clear idea of why Tom was the second person after Peter that I approached to join us in the Tax Summit this week. It feels like a weekend. It's not. It's a Thursday, Friday, but it's 2 days. And I'm very pleased to say Peter Lewis from Essential is here. Jason, I nearly called you Jason Ward. Mark Cernzak from the Tax Justice Network Australia as well, who are both partners in the event. We're also partnering with Prosper Australia, Anglicare, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, ACOS, Oxfam, The Next Economy, the National Foundation for Australian Women, Think Forward, as I said, Get Up, Our Community, which is the peak body for the community sector, the Uniting Church is supporting us through Tax Justice Network, and the Community Tax Project at the University of Melbourne. Our opening keynote tomorrow morning will be from Dr. Ken Henry. The afternoon keynote will be from Professor Miranda Stewart, and then day 2's keynote is Catherine Trebek from the Wellbeing Economy. We have panel sessions discussing topics ranging from a broad look at inequality with Cassandra Goldie, Sharon Bessel and Roger Wilkins, housing with Saul Eslake, Alan Kohler, Maya Ziz and Tim Helm. I won't go through all the names. It's a terrific lineup of people. So why are we doing it? We're doing it because, as Tom said, the tax and transfer system has reached a breaking point. If we believe that it exists in order to invest in our common wealth, in our common good, and to provide not just a safety net, but a genuine form of security and opportunity for people to build a good life, then it is not doing its purpose anymore. On your tables, you will see copies of a flyer for our 2024 annual per capita tax survey. It's in its 15th year, goes back to 2010. very generously funded by David Morowitz's Social Justice Fund, and we have built up over that time a longitudinal data set of the community's attitudes towards the tax and transfer system. And what it shows us at the moment is there is a peak level of dissatisfaction with the way the tax and transfer system is working. We've had the highest proportion of people on record saying that they personally feel they pay too much tax, and that wealthy people and large businesses don't pay enough, that the tax system is not fair. And around 2/3 of people we surveyed, when we asked them directly, do you think our tax and transfer system reduces wealth and income inequality, 2/3 of them said it either did nothing to reduce that inequality or actively made it worse. Younger people were more likely to say it made it worse. Now, what Tom's talking about is a generational crisis, but what we're really seeing is a society-wide crisis. That a lot of the reforms that were put in place after the Second World War, genuine social democratic shift in how we think about the economy, that gave power to working people, that created the welfare state, that ensured that the efforts of the state and of our Commonwealth were invested to give all people opportunity, have been eroded over time. So that now we're seeing young people say, we just want the same opportunities as previous generations. Of course, yes, their parents and grandparents and possibly even great-grandparents did benefit from that post-war compact, but we're actually returning to a time when their great-great-grandparents were not supported by the state. There was no healthcare that was universally applied. There was no social housing. There was very little investment in education. Education was either provided privately or through charities. And the idea that the creation of that world that invested in people and gave people opportunity, that young people have grown up just thinking that was the way things were. It's not. We have to fight for it every day, because the forces, and we're seeing this in America, it's like the Wizard of Oz has come out from behind the curtain and the billionaire class is no longer pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They are openly trying to take over our democracies. If we do not have these conversations, then we will lose all of the gains, and it will take us generations again to get them back. What we're seeing emerge now as a generational crisis of inequality will, as older people who do have wealth die and pass that wealth down, will just become a good old-fashioned class divide. And will just entrench the kind of class divisions that our parents and grandparents fought so hard to overcome in the wake of World War II. We're seeing at this time, it's 5 years coming up for when we first went into lockdown under COVID. And that's when I met my friend Janet McCullman online, and we decided that we'd write a book about what happens next. How do we rebuild? How do we reconstruct Australia after COVID? We recognised that was a time of crisis, of economic crisis and of social crisis that was unprecedented since the Second World War. We don't tend to have traditional ground wars, although in different parts of the world, obviously, that is re-emerging as well. But in the developed world, we have tended to ameliorate that sort of risk of conflict through trade. But this was actually a similar crisis in terms of what it exposed about the fault lines in our economy, about the growing inequalities in our economy, and about people's loss of trust that the system is going to help them. And we've got huge forces now that are desperately trying to snap us back to the way things were before we recognised those massive ruptures during that time of crisis. It's important that we don't give this opportunity up without a fight. Too many of the conversations we have about the tax and transfer system are dominated by people who do very well out of the existing system. Most political commentators, economists that are full-time in the game, big business and organisations that are able to lobby parliamentarians have a stake in keeping the status quo. The fact that young people are now recognising that, even as Tom said, if they come from a comfortable middle-class background and they've done everything right, they've finished school. Let's remember only about 13% of Australians finished school 40 years ago. It's now 87% or 90%. Only about 14% of people went on to university. It's now nearly half of us. And so when young people have done everything right, they've got the degree, they've got the job that pays well, but they still can't afford to buy a home, or if they can, it's a good 2 hours from where they work. Their job security is low because we've casualised and deregulated everything. They see that we're not investing in saving the planet, let alone taking the opportunities that will come from a net zero economy. Then they're right to feel despair because it is a broken social contract. It's not an intergenerational war though. There are a good proportion of people, we always hear about wealthy baby boomers, but a good 29 to 33% on average of people aged over 65 live in really dire circumstances. Over a third of single women over the age of 65 live in permanent income poverty. This is because they don't own their own home and they rely on the age pension. We actually have some of the highest rates of pensioner poverty in the OECD. We have the lowest rate, only second to the UK, although they're addressing it, so we'll soon take out the crown here, for the lowest rate of income support for unemployed people. Our health system is crumbling. We found in this year's tax survey a huge jump in the number of people that said they personally pay more income tax, despite feeling they're paying too much. 60% said they pay more for better health and aged care services, because there's awareness in the community that it's almost impossible to get a bulk billing appointment in some parts of something like 10% of our communities. There's a real crisis we saw emerge in aged care during the pandemic, when those privatised services were found to be hotbeds of disease and infection. Early childhood education and care finally is being recognised by this government as a social infrastructure worth investing in, but we've still got one side of politics who's calling that irresponsible recurrent spending. We must have this conversation, and we must do so in a way that brings in the voices of people that otherwise don't get a say in this debate. Allegra Spender was on Insiders on Sunday, and she and her advisors and the good people of Wentworth, whom she represents, have put a lot of work into a tax green paper, and she should be commended for that. It's a thoughtful piece of work. But Wentworth's the most wealthy electorate in the country. And within her green paper are suggestions that, for example, we lower the rate of business tax and increase the rate of GST to compensate. Or there is also a statement that the revenue base is adequate and so the tax take doesn't need to grow. I'd challenge some of those suggestions. And while I think it's important that every voice is included in this debate, we mustn't let it be dominated by the people that are doing very, very well out of a system that is creating greater inequality in this country than we have seen in almost 100 years. I'm going to finish up with a few damaging stats before Tom and I open this up, because I can tell you're all dying to say something. In January, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who I think does think deeply about these things actually, released the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, the update on the budget, and was very clear in that, drawing on the 2023 intergenerational report, that in the coming 40 years we have significant revenue deficits. We will not have enough projected revenue and income to fund adequately the NDIS or the health system or the aged care system. There was shown in that same intergenerational report that our growth rate will be low and that younger generations can expect to earn less in real terms than they have in previous years. Last week, the Monash Sustainability Institute put out a report that showed that now in Australia, and this is shocking, 57% of our national wealth is held by the top 10% of us in terms of how much wealth they already hold. 57% goes to the top 10%. That leaves 43% to be shared amongst the other 90%. And the day after Jim put out his MyEFO in January, Treasury released the Tax Expenditures and Insights Statement, brought forward by a month, strategic perhaps, that showed and included new measures in there that have not previously been revealed. But it showed that $70 billion a year is foregone in government revenue for tax concessions on individual income from investments. And over half of that goes to the same top 10% of people. So not only do that 10% control 57% of our shared wealth, our common wealth, but they're getting over $35 billion a year in tax concessions to help them hold on to and grow and hoard that wealth. And that's $35 billion a year that could be spent on a public education system, on fixing and restoring genuinely universal Medicare, on building social housing, and on investing in a net zero economy and the jobs and the opportunities that come with it. So that's why we're hosting this tax summit over the next 2 days. The timing is very deliberate. We didn't want to do it during an election campaign, and we're not inviting politicians to come and spruik their wares. This is about kicking off a conversation, because what Jim Chalmers said when he handed down his first budget in 2022 was, we do need to think differently. It's a direct quote, we do need to think differently. The biggest spending pressures in the years ahead are things we really value. So if we have to think, if we do value them, how do we make room for them in the budget? We need to have a big conversation with the Australian people. In the years since, that conversation's only become more and more difficult. Just the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts, which were shepherded through finally just over a year ago, were painted as a terrible broken promise by much of the right-wing media. Funnily enough, they're the most popular measure this government has implemented in the community. And so if we don't start talking about tax now, we certainly won't be allowed to talk about it after the election, because we'll be told, no one said you were going to do that. You didn't make any election commitments, so we can't have the conversation. We're not asking either side to give us election commitments. What we're doing is showing that the community has the appetite for that big conversation, and that it has to involve all of us, and it has to start from the basis that we ask ourselves, what kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be the kind of country that gives our young people opportunity to build a good life, that cares for the sick and the elderly, that educates our young children, and that takes care of our planet and our ecology so that they have a planet to live on? Or do we want to return to the days before social democratic parties invested in ordinary people, before the Second World War, on an individual idea that says it's every man for himself? I don't think we want that. I don't think anyone in this room wants that. And that's what we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. So if you haven't got a ticket, you've missed out, but we'll be recording it all. I know some of you are coming in person and many of you are joining us online. So that's the spiel. And Tom and I are now very happy to have a chat to all of you about what your thoughts are. And I'm going to start with a young person over here.
Hi, Virginia Wills from RMIT, but as a single mum with an 8-year-old, I love the tax wealth not work, very catchy. And when you talk about games, I thought of the game we've got at home, Pocket Money, which I think was designed by Mel Burney at the board game. But then I think about Monopoly, which was designed by socialists, but then taken over by a capitalist company, which makes a lot of money off that game. But absolutely agree, and think it's so that we're talking about tax, break out in rash and hot sweats, even trying to talk about it. And I've got a law and commerce degree, or maybe that's why I get sweats. But yeah, so just love to know a little bit more about what that tax wealth not work actually means and looks like, and how we can talk about it with confidence and to sell that idea and be able to talk about tax as progressives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the question. I try to talk about it with confidence, but it can be daunting, because if you talk about taxing wealth, people are like, oh, you're just envious or jealous, or work harder, or I've worked hard for my money, how dare you try and take it off me? So it is a really difficult kind of space to try and wander into. So it is all about, back to core principles. It's like, why are we rewarding someone just speculating or accumulating wealth over people who are working, or people who are caring for others, or people who are going to university to learn? Like, we're investing in the wrong things. And that's the core to the idea of taxing wealth not work. Like, we're not calling for like a massive wealth tax on billionaires or any sort of simplistic solutions like that. It's about replumbing our tax system to go like, do we really need to spend that $30-40 billion on tax concessions for people who are already wealthy? Could we spend that money on education instead? So we support the people who don't have assets over the people who already do. So there's a whole, I guess the 5 proposals are, we try and even up the tax system so wealth is taxed like work. And then we also think about how we tax existing wealth, and you mentioned inheritance, Emma, and how that's going to be a massive driver of inequality in the coming decades. Like, how do we think about that stock of wealth and how that's spent and passed on? And then it's all about using that money that we've raised by winding back our world-leading array of tax breaks, concessions, and taxing wealth properly to invest in the community, to try and support workers, and make sure that we have a budget that supports funding aged care, which is really important, funding health, funding climate action, funding all these things we need. And then super specific, we are going to release another reports like how do we adjust negative gearing or franking credits, or this is what we spend money on. But I guess those 5 high-level principles, this is kind of where we're at the moment.
Thank you. Janet?
Thanks very much for both of you. Terrific, lots of thoughts. What I want to query is about the politics of how you do it. That simply everyone getting riled up and putting on things on social media, and it's sort of get-up politics, but it does nothing. It achieves nothing. You only achieve anything if you've got a political movement that's organised and focused and gets into government. Now, the assumption that's been running through some of the talk today already has been that the Labor Party doesn't care about these things. It does. It's full of young people who are suffering these very same things. And the point is that you're not going to get anything done unless Labor as a movement is really strong and is not talked down endlessly by people who say, oh, they're just as bad as the Liberals, they never do anything. They've done an incredible amount under this government, which you never hear about. But it's an incredible amount that's actually helped working class people. Oh dear, that's why you don't hear about it. Now, you're not going to achieve anything if you haven't got a political movement that is respected and treated with due respect to fight these things out. Because it's only Labor that will do it. The Greens won't do it. The Greens don't understand, in fact. They're get-up politics. Now, you know, the things that we're grappling with, the things that have got us to this point, are deep demographic and social changes which go back to 1945. The structure of our population is entirely different. We have a very large aspirant middle class who have 2 degrees. Sorry though, there's not enough space in the middle class economy for you to have a career. So we've now got big issues. We've got people who live a lot longer. And the things that made the social welfare revolution possible, the social democratic revolution, I mean, after the Second World War, was simply the terror of communism that came to the capitalist class after the Second World War. When that dissipated, they got back to go and read Piketty on how that happened. So we're actually dealing with very big issues, and people are making a decision about protecting the future by not having children.
All very important points, Janet, as usual. And I'd just like to back something up there. I had a piece in Pills and Irritations yesterday or the day before, because in our most recent newsletter I thought, well, we're hearing a lot about this government's a do-nothing government. It's very hard for them to get a message out about the things they have actually done. And sure, there might be a narrative lacking there from the government itself. But when I set out to write about some of the things that we had been advocating for the last 5 to 10 years and saw what had been achieved, there was quite a long list. There's a lot of investment in the care economy, in the wages of low-paid women in the aged care and early childhood sector, big lift in the minimum wage, the redistribution of the tax cuts, the commitment to 3 days a week of early childhood care and education, introducing paid placements for social work, nurses, teaching students. The list goes on and on. I think I came up with about 26 or 27 before I had to stop for word count. It is important that we do push back against that idea that it's a pox on both their houses, they're all the same, nothing can be achieved unless we do it outside the system, because it's actually the democratic system is the only thing that has ever worked for the mass of people. And so I had this argument once with a former independent MP at a meeting about gender equality and women's rights, and she said in this meeting that both major parties had been as bad as each other on women's rights, and it was just, I felt Susan Ryan rolling in her grave over my shoulder, and I just had to say, it's just nonsense. The facts show that that's nonsense. And so while I respect that a lot of young people are becoming disenfranchised from our system of government, that's largely because it's failing to give them the opportunities that the system's meant to promise them. And so I do agree with Janet. There are a lot of people in Labor that think deeply about this, not least the Treasurer. And let's be clear, whatever the outcome, the only way we are going to get meaningful tax reform that works in the interests of working people is through a Labor government. Even a minority Liberal government with the support of teal independents is not going to have the interests of people that we care about at their heart. So that's a political question, so I took it.
Very good.
Pete.
Firstly, Thomas, it's great that you can be young up till 40.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm clinging on.
And you can join CODA, the Council of the Ageing, from 55. So
There's only a little gap.
narrow window between being young and old, which is great. I just wanted to, we ran some polling this week in the Essential Report on attitudes to tax and services. And there's something really interesting coming through that I just want to throw at you, which is traditionally you find younger people being more progressive on most issues and more pro-government regulation. But what we've been picking up, particularly over the last 18 months, are a couple of trends. One is that now young people tend to be more libertarian in their responses. They're less likely to support government interventions on everything from the internet to housing. And the second one was, we asked in this week's report, gave people three choices. Would you, if you had a choice, higher taxes, more services, maintain or lower? Outlay, younger people, lower taxes, lower services. And I think this speaks to the bigger piece, because if the system's not delivering for you, of course, you're not going to support a tax and transfer system. So I think there is a moment where your generation are actually up for grabs at the moment because of the way the system's operating, and you can see what's happened in America with this, that younger people all of a sudden say, tear the whole thing down, it's not working. It's a big shift from saying reform the system to tear it down. So while this is a tax summit, it's actually a democracy summit as well. And I think, tax shouldn't be in the pigeonhole, and, we've got to get behind your organisation and other organisations, because it's not a given, progressive young people anymore.
Yeah, I agree. We've picked up on the same thing over the last 3 or 4 years, and I saw your polling, and that jumped out at me that younger people supported higher tax, better public services the least. And when we started Think Forward, we kind of had this theory that as millennials and Gen Z became the bigger voting blocks, that it would lead to more progressive politics. And I think in the last 12 months, 18 months, I have much less confidence in that idea, that it's just a matter of time and demographics, that younger generations will sweep through and they care about social justice and climate change and public services. And I worry that that's no longer true. And I think we have lost, perhaps driven by the economic situation we find ourselves in, when people are struggling financially, so they sort of turn inwards and want to look after themselves, plus the impact of social media, which is driving division.
Plus the lockdown effect.
Plus the lockdown effect.
He said to me, young people particularly,
Yeah.
government overreach, they would say.
Yeah. And we get fed this thing like invest in cryptocurrencies and look after yourself and your family, or tax is a burden and it's stealing from me, and that's become really powerful, and that's kind of the message that younger people are getting, and I think it is eroding that social justice perspective as number one, and I think it's a big problem. I think in the court of public opinion we might be starting to lose, and that's really worrying, that lack of awareness of, I guess, of how the tax system works, combined with the economic situation people find themselves in, is really fertile ground for narratives of burning everything down and everything's broken and politicians aren't listening, and let's just go with some strong man because at least he stands up to people, apparently.
It's not an accident though, right? It's been a deliberate project by the right, by the vested, by the wealthy, to undermine the collective to the point at which people don't see value in it anymore. And I would say, as I have many times, the left is responsible for that. We have not adequately made the case for what should be our own core beliefs. And we've been so busy fighting amongst ourselves that suddenly we've woken up and fascism's back. So I do think it's come through in our research as well. When we did our housing monitor survey, we found even amongst wealthy older people there was more support for more social housing than there was amongst poorer younger people, because younger people don't see public or social housing as an option. It's a stigmatised thing. They don't have any memory of a time when many people right through the working and lower middle class grew up in good, comfortable social homes. They don't have as much faith in the system to do things for them because that system has been deliberately degraded by a project of people, and the ultimate outcome is Elon Musk trying to take over your country. So. Back here and then you, mate.
Thank you. Andrew Boatman, resident of Ballarat Commonwealth Electoral Division, Ripon State Electoral Division. Well, I won't go through that again. Andrew, are the voices of what politicians would call rural and regional Australians being heard? Just for example, in your survey of 1,000 that you referred to, where are the voices coming from? And perhaps more general but related, is decentralisation still important? Is it something that we should focus on? Is there an argument that the tax and transfer system should support or facilitate decentralisation?
In terms of regional voices, we looked at our sample and it was pretty representative in terms of a split between metropolitan and rural. I'm from Tasmania, my GM's from Coffs Harbour. I'm not saying that gives us perspective into well, it kind of does give us perspective. Yeah. We definitely want to make sure this isn't just an inner city kind of professional class kind of thing that we're trying to do. I think those regional voices matter. The blue collar voices matter. We need to. I don't want to get into some critique of identity politics where we break everyone down into little buckets and try and have individual policies for each group. This needs to be a broad spectrum kind of coalition around the tax system, because it is central to our lives and it requires broad coalition. So always mindful of regional communities for sure.
Our surveys are also nationally representative by region and city. And you do find differences in views on things like housing in particular across the regions compared to the cities. I do think there's a danger that our debate on these issues is dominated by educated people that coalesce in inner suburbs. And that plays out, and when it's played out in the housing debate, there was no convincing the Greens that their idea of freezing rents might help young people in Brunswick, but would really, really, really devastate single parents living in Ballarat in a low-income house. There's a lot of other policies that are, there's a lot of criticism in Victoria, for example, about the suburban rail loop being a waste of money, but it comes from people that live in Richmond and have a 10-minute trip into the city and probably haven't been on a train since they were at uni. So it is important that these voices are heard. I think one of Australia's big challenges is that while we're an enormous nation, most of us concentrated in cities on the eastern seaboard. 15 years ago when I was working for the Communications Minister, the idea was that the NBN was going to create this huge era of decentralisation and we'd all not have to cram into cities anymore. I think if you look at COVID, people actually kind of like that. They think, why should I have to spend 40 minutes going into the city when I can do my job from anywhere? But shifting that economic model that is based around cities, there are downsides that come with decentralisation, but we're not adequately considering it, I think, in terms of our body politic. I know John Brumby at the moment is talking a lot about creating, new economic centres out in Bundoora and different parts of Melbourne, and I think that is something we are going to have to consider if we're not going to keep expecting people that work minimum wage jobs to move an hour and a half away from where they work in order to buy a modest 3-bedroom house. So all these ideas have to be on the table. Hey.
I probably don't need one.
No, that's all right.
May Lamb for Capita, on leave at the moment. I just wanted to make a couple of observations, if I can. One of them is that I think that there's a very good chance that as, populations as they are younger can forget or not see the services that they access for which their taxes pay.
Yep.
And I think that is associated with the need for something that's called civics education, which is apparently on performance declining in Australia and not very prominent in our curriculum. And so I'm interested in this idea that, you know, that across the population, whether young people are going to be enlisted to campaign activity, they just don't need stronger information about what government is and what the state provides for that takes care of collective needs to which our taxes contribute, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that whole sort of base of information with which young people are equipped really needs to be laid down institutionally in the school system or through other, you know, community connector kind of things.
Yeah.
So people in the justice system, for example, like what's government for, you know, what's prison, like even, like there's all sorts of interesting places where you could do that. So that I'm just, you know, I'm just floating that. And in a similar vein, I think on this issue about tax and wealth, there's a sort of missing voice, which is very hard to elicit because this is like more pornographic than pornography, which is that older people talking about the wealth they accumulated accidentally. I did. Superannuation, my house, my holiday house. You know, it is extraordinary to look at it and realise that I never thought I would get this rich when I was young. I never thought I would. But who's talking about it?
No.
You know? And the question is, can we push any of that into the public narrative to give lived experience? Usually lived experience comes from poverty or disadvantage, but I think we need lived experience from wealth as well to animate the argument. Now, it's not easy, but it's an idea.
I'm going to let Tom talk in a minute about his TikTok tax and educating people in civics. So I just want to make two observations. Firstly, Janet's point about the size of the middle class now, I think, is absolutely material to whether or not people are valuing services. What our research has shown is that amongst middle class people, appreciation for public services peaks amongst women aged between 30 and 45 because they're interacting with the system for the first time when they have children. It's not as high, that appreciation, amongst men because they're not the ones that are doing the engagement with that system. So the health system, the early childhood education and care system, paid parental leave, it's often the first time young middle class people engage directly with services and their appreciation goes up. And the second thing, I think you're absolutely right, that we do need to hear more from people who, as John Howard once said, no one ever stopped me in the street and complained about the value of their house going up. But our Housing Monitor survey found actually there was significant concern amongst people aged over 55 about the housing market because they're suddenly realising, hang on, I thought I'd done really well, but now my kids have to live an hour and a half away from me. If I want them to own a house, I'm going to have to clean out my super. So suddenly they're recognising that imbalance. But Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. On the lived experience of older generations, it's definitely playing out. They want to help when they help their kids through giving them a home deposit, which is like 60% of people now need the help of mum or dad, or they pay off student loans, or they let their kids live at home till they're 30 when they go into university. Like, there's a lot of intergenerational support going on, but it's within families, and whether we can, and then whether we can broaden that out to think about it shouldn't just be your direct children or grandchildren benefiting, but the entire all our younger people, and making sure that that opportunity is there for all of them.
I think, people they've lost such faith in the ability of the system to practice redistribution that they're thinking, okay, I'll just do it within my own family. At least I can look after my own kids, and then you become.
Post-transfer will has been
Yes.
within families historically.
Yes.
I don't think it's anything new, and it's very good what's happening.
And I'm not suggesting it's new. I'm suggesting that there are more people now with more wealth that is going to be passed down, and they're much less open to sharing that with the community than perhaps working in lower middle class people would have been in the past. But,
And yeah, absolutely agree on the civics education. It sits alongside, like, it is tax literacy. It's like, how does our government, tax systems, public services, how does that all work? I did a silly video last year where I rode around the city and was like filmed everything that had been paid with by tax dollars, like your railroads and your swimming pools and your roads and the hospital, like just so much, and just building up that awareness that tax isn't a burden, it's an investment in our community. I think that's a really important story, and yeah, how our government works and why we vote and all these things we need to build back up a bit.
We've got an online question that Rebecca might read out for us.
So Adrian asks, when we think about what we should tax, income and land seem to be fair, but is consumption reasonable? Should we get rid of the GST?
The GST, it was always going to come up. No, we shouldn't necessarily get rid of it, but it is an inherently regressive tax. Now, it's beloved by accountants and tax policy experts in Treasury because it's simple and it's hard for people to avoid. So the argument is that if you raise the GST, wealthy people spend more of their income on consumer goods and therefore we'll get more tax from wealthy people. I'm just going to pause until that stops. Okay, and that's certainly true, but, and it's a big but, the proportion of their income that poorer people spend in the economy is much higher, and so it's an inherently regressive tax. Ken Henry's giving our opening keynote tomorrow. He is a proponent of lifting the GST or broadening the base. It's not an idea that shouldn't be discussed, but I would argue very strongly that if that is put in place, the argument is that you compensate people at the bottom. That compensation never lasts. It never keeps up with the increased cost. So if someone was going to argue vociferously for that, I might respond by saying, okay, fine, you'll have to lift the tax-free threshold at $45,000 and index it. So I think there are better ways. I think consumption taxes are easy to administer. They're hard to avoid, and there is an argument that they capture wealthier people. But given the amount of wealth that's hoarded and not spent in our economy, which has been a big driver of this inequality, I don't think it comes close to touching the sides of how we need to reframe the system. Now there's one over here and then this over here.
Just
Microphones there. Just helps our friends at home hear you.
Sorry about that. This two-day seminar that's coming up, you've got a very good lineup of speakers there. Would you consider a succinct summary of the main points that come out of that and to email it to all the people in this room, and we could pick up those points and email, I don't mean social media, email our local members to argue the case?
We'll be doing even more than that. So the entire event's going to be recorded. Peter's team will be making sure that it's fully interactive for people at home, and we'll be able to gather the thoughts of everyone in that room. We're then going to use the sessions, the information that comes out of the sessions and the feedback from participants in the summit to draft what I hope will be a community sector green paper on tax reform that we would then present to an incoming government. But we would also bring out of that sort of key elements that we think are persuasive arguments from Tom's campaign, from the Tax Justice Network's work on international tax avoidance, on a whole range of issues around welfare and housing and how we can reform the system from the ground up. So the summit doesn't end with thank you very much, we'll go away and think about it. We'll be bombarding you all with ideas and information that we can use to advocate for systems change over the coming term of Parliament.
Excellent. Yeah.
Young man over here.
Yep. Hi, I'm Planning. I'm a fourth-year medical student from Melbourne Medical School. I definitely agree with the point about civic education, and there was a recent ABC article about, how I think understanding of civics and citizenship has been at its lowest this year. I'm just then wondering, as tax is a cornerstone of our system as well, how education and public funding and how that distribution between funding of public schools and private schools contribute to this regulation or standardization of civic education.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So that the RBA data which showed that economics education had dropped by 70% in high schools, a lot of that decline was in lower socioeconomic areas and girls as well. So even where there are that sort of civics or economics education, it is probably in private inner city schools. So I think there is definitely a big issue in terms of the public versus private sector and the massive divide increasingly between those two different systems. And again, coming back to family wealth, if you've got the right parents, you get to go to a private school. If you don't, you get to go to the public school down the road, which is underfunded. And I think that has a big impact on who understands the system and who participates in tax debates or civics debates. And I think making sure that education isn't based on where you went to school is really important.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that of course, if that situation continues, it's just privilege replicating itself. And it's not just economic capital that then privileged people hold. It's all the cultural capital and all of the social capital and the ability to make change. And so we have to keep reaching out and down and behind us and bringing people with us because otherwise we'll just become part of the problem. That's all we've got time for, folks. But there's going to be a lot more chat over the next 2 days. I didn't mention before, Raina's here as well from Prosper, another one of our partners. Raina Fay, thank you so much for joining us tomorrow. I'm really chuffed with the way this program's come together. We've got some fantastic people speaking to you about how we can build a better future. And all of our volunteers on the day are going to be wearing yellow t-shirts that says "Build Our Future" on the back, which was Merida's slogan, and I think it's lovely. We are committed to this fight. It won't be a quick one. Raina can attest, the Prosper and the Georges have been trying to fight on land tax for about 150 years, I think. But as Susan Ryan always said to me, relentless optimism, Emma. So let's bear that in mind and look forward to 2 days of really interesting conversation about tax and transfer. And Thomas, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
And we'll see you next month. In third week of March is Scott Hamilton, John Brumby. Is that the one we're doing next month? Yeah, on how to make good policy. So come along, that'll be a good chat too.
Oh, of course, thank you.